Hi, welcome to Synapse Talks from Synapse U of T. In this podcast, we chat with people about their work, careers, and insights within the incredible discipline of neuroscience. In this episode, Arthi and Bilal meet with Dr. Kaela Singleton. Dr. Singleton is a campaign manager and the co-founder of Black in Neuro. We filmed this episode in February 2024, but the ideas in our conversations are timeless. Enjoy!
Hi everyone, welcome to Synapse Talks. This is a podcast where we sit down and chat with neuroscience professionals to learn a bit more about their work and their lives. I'm Arthi and this is
Bilal.
And today we're joined by
Dr. Kaela Singleton.
Dr. Singleton is the co-founder of Black in Neuro, and this is a campaign manager where she identifies and turns big, bold, innovative ideas into impactful plans within the scientific community, allowing researchers to further advance in their own careers. Dr. Singleton, it's such a pleasure to have you on here today. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm super happy to be here with y'all.
Sounds great. I know we're all eager to get to know you some more. I know I am, and I'm sure your experience and pathway to where you are now is something that we can all gain valuable insights from. So can you maybe tell us a bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, so I am a Black Samoan queer woman. I am 32 years old, and I got interested in neuroscience in the 7th grade. I then took that interest, which I'm sure we'll talk about maybe a little bit later, and used it to figure out where I wanted to go to college. At the time in the 2010s, there were a lot of neuroscience majors or programs in the country. And so I picked where I wanted to go to college based off of that. And I should say at the time in my youth, I actually wasn't really interested in science at all. I like to read books and listen to music. I did not care about biology or chemistry. I wasn't bad at them, but I wasn't interested in them in a way that I think a lot of media portrays people as being interested in science from the day they were born.
Yeah.
And so everybody was really surprised that I wanted to go to college to study neuroscience. All my teachers were deeply confused. But then I ended up going to Agnes Scott College, which is a private all women's college in Decatur, Georgia. And they had really small class sizes and tons of opportunities for me to do neuroscience outreach and work in different labs. And so I did that, and I double majored in classical history and neuroscience, and I got my bachelor's of science there. And then I went on immediately after graduation to attend Georgetown University for my PhD in Washington, D.C. And that was wonderful. It was a bit stressful, but it was a really great experience. And then after my PhD, I did my postdoc at Emory University in Atlanta in an effort to move back to Georgia, where my family is from. And now I work in the nonprofit sphere.
Okay. That's very interesting. And I have to ask, why classical history?
Yeah, the actual truth of that answer is that I was really bad at Spanish. I think I had taken up until that point, I had taken a year of Spanish every year since the 2nd grade, and I was very bad at it. It was comically awful. And so I needed a foreign language, and the only option that wasn't Spanish or Spanish adjacent was Latin or ancient Greek. And I thought that was really cool. And in my mind, I was I won't have to speak ancient Greek because who does that? And that's not true. We did eventually have to actually speak it. But a majority of learning that language was translating things. And so once I started taking that as my foreign language, I had so many credits that it was I might as well just be a classics major while I'm at it. And I actually really enjoyed it. It was a nice balance between doing science stuff and non-science stuff.
Okay. That's cool. It's interesting because I feel usually, I know with my peers and my own friends, myself included, usually when people double major or anything like that, usually it's something that's related to their kind of big major, but it's still cool to see somebody go for something that they're hey, actually this is interesting, and you know what, why not for the hell of it? So that's cool.
No, it does. The way that you're talking about makes much more sense than my way of just being oh, this seems neat.
And Bilal?
Okay, so can you tell us what inspired you to enter your field and how that led you to where you are right now?
Yeah. So I think like when I was in some like seventh grade science class, and we got the opportunity to like dissect a bunch of different animal brains because we were doing like a neuroscience based module. And I just thought that was really neat because one of the conversations that we like kept having, we were in the seventh grade, so it wasn't like a deep philosophical conversation, but was just around how weird it was that like this very squishy thing like makes people who they are and makes animals who they are, like in that way. And then as I got older, I just became really interested in like trying to find ways to describe myself. I grew up in like a predominantly white area in like the suburbs, and I was like one of like very few Black or brown people in my school. And so I was just always interested in like what makes us different and why are our experiences so different, and like kind of what I think is like a good naive way that like youths don't really know what's going on in the world. And so I tried to take more like psychology based classes to be like, oh, maybe there's some sort of like, I don't know, like psychological basis for like why we're all different or what's going on. And then I didn't really enjoy those classes, if I'm being completely honest. I did not like them at all. And when I was looking for school for like colleges again, I just remember really liking neuroscience, and I was like, there's got to be something to this that makes it more interesting. And then what was the second half of your question? Oh, how did I get to where I am now?
Yeah, how did it lead you to where you are now?
Yeah. And so I think at like the core of my career journey has really just been an innate curiosity for like what makes people or cells or whatever the way that they are, like what drives us to be ambitious, what makes us interested in neuroscience versus I don't know, like history. And so when I was leaving college, I had had a bunch of like undergraduate research experiences that were really valuable and great. And I was good at doing science. That also plays like a very big role in my story, particularly as a person who enjoys doing things that they're good at. I'm not a one of those people who like isn't afraid to be seen trying. I actually am deeply afraid of being seen failing at something. So I was like, I'm good at this. I like it. I have a degree in it, so I should go to graduate school. That was kind of another naive decision on my part. I don't really think I thought a lot about grad school and what it would be like. I just knew that like it was a continuation of something I was already doing, and I was good at school. So I was like, there's no way I'll suck at this, or the chances are like very low is kind of my take on it. And so I decided to go to DC just because Georgetown was close to the NIH, and I knew I needed a job after graduation. And I was like, there are tons of jobs in DC, and I can definitely get one somewhere. And so I think to answer your question, like broadly, a big driving factor for me was like trying to like find myself and figure out who I was, and doing that in like an academic setting was always really helpful. And then kind of at each step in my career, from undergrad to grad to even in my postdoc, it's been about like refining those things and being like, oh, what makes me like happy? What do I like doing versus what do I not like doing? If that makes sense.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because I feel a lot of people would relate to what you said about just the squishy thing making us who we are, and that pushing them into going into neuroscience. I know I can relate to that. So really interesting to hear.
And there's like, I don't know, there are like 1,000 ways to answer that question, right? Like,
yeah, true.
So you can like build upon it over time.
So now I have to say, I'm wondering if there were maybe any particular challenges or obstacles that you faced throughout kind of just maybe grad school or even undergrad, or even later on. And if so, how did you overcome them?
Yeah, I think there were definitely challenges. So when I was in undergrad, my mom died when I was a junior in college, and that was like really hard. Just because I think of like, at least for me, my parents are very much like guiding lights in the things that I do. And so that was like something that was unexpected. And I kind of had to readjust my focus and priorities to like figure out what I was doing with my life. And then when I was in, I think that plays into a bigger theme that happened when I was in grad school, where I had some like experiences with mentors that were like really crappy, like a lot of racism, some mild sexism, and that like intersection of like misogynoir, of like my Blackness and my womanness. And those things were like, I think really more than anything, they're like jolts to your confidence about your ability to do what you're doing, because graduate school is innately hard, right? Like there's a part of it where there's no like right or wrong answer. Like you're discovering something, you're like figuring it out. So you do have to have like a lot of confidence in yourself to like stick around and like keep sort of failing and like trying new things. And so I think in a decent way when like your mentors aren't super helpful in that. Like if they're making you question your confidence, it can be difficult. And so I feel like I dealt with a lot of those challenges by having to like find really good like peer networks, like really good friends, and people that could like reinstill confidence in me, if that makes sense. And I think that that's pretty much been like a consistent theme in terms of like the obstacles that I face, is like experiencing something difficult and then trying to find like a community or a network of people that I like know and trust and love who can like help you get through that.
Yeah, definitely. I can't imagine how hard that is, by the way, losing a parent, which is, already hard. And then on top of that, dealing with racism and sexism. And I think, like you mentioned, definitely having a good peer support system is something that I personally also have relied on a lot, not just in undergrad, but throughout my academic years. So thank you for sharing, by the way.
Thank you. All right. Let's get into some of your research that you used to do before. So back in your research days, you were investigating Menkes disease. What drove your investigation into rare genetic diseases?
Yeah. This is actually really so Menkes disease was work that I did in my postdoc, and that story is like very serendipitous. So when I was in undergrad, my primary mentor was Dr. Jennifer Larimore. She was at Agnes Scott College, and we studied neurodevelopmental disorders, really specifically like Alzheimer's and Rett syndrome, not Alzheimer's, autism spectrum disorder, sorry, and Rett syndrome, and some of the like earlier hallmarks of schizophrenia, which is considered a neurodevelopmental disorder. And her postdoc mentor was Victor Fontes, who was my postdoc mentor. So Victor and I had always we were like science grandchildren. I don't know. He was like my science grandpa. So I'd always known him, but I never like officially worked with him. And so when I went to graduate school, my work was in like just basic neural development, not disorder-based research, like how does the brain come together? And so for my postdoc, I knew that I wanted to study neurodevelopmental disorders again. I knew Victor like existed and that he was really nice. And so I was like, oh, I can work with Victor. That would be cool. Yeah. And so I reached out to him and he started talking to me about the work that he was doing in Menkes disease, which is a systemic depletion of copper from the body. It's a rare genetic disease. And its counterpoint is called Wilson's disease, which is a systemic like overexpression of copper in the body. And he was using this really unique approach and perspective to like asking questions about Menkes disease by using multiple animal models. So he was using cell lines, he was using fibroblasts from patients, and he was using fruit flies to do some like genetic manipulations and see phenotypes. And my thesis work was in multiple animal models, which is something that I've always just like, I think it's really interesting to be able to like use a specific model to ask the right question, as opposed to just relying on like solely rat-based research or mouse-based research. And so I got into the work in a very serendipitous way, but it ended up being like very in line with the work that I had always been doing. And I felt really like fortunate, if that makes sense. Like it felt like sheer luck that he was like working on this disease that I didn't technically know anything about, but like the approach to how he was going about it, I was familiar with.
That's really cool. Yeah.
I hope your science grandpa is doing well.
Yes.
You briefly talked about your research days. If we can maybe hold that thought for a minute, in a field where new discoveries, unfold every minute or so, the scientific community, and maybe this is just my opinion, but the scientific community has historically embraced more so new research, while most of the time being resistant to, I think, more new and novel ideas. So what does it really mean to be different, and how has this shaped your experience when you entered the neuroscience and research field?
Yeah, I really love that question. I think it's interesting on both like an empirical science level, but also on like a person level. There's this like innate sense of discovery about science, right? Like everybody's looking for an explanation to like wonders or whatever, or challenging the status quo of how we used to think about something. And I think in a data-driven way, you always see resistance to new schools of thought, or like people disproving like the amyloid hypothesis in Alzheimer's disease, for example, where it came out that a lot of that work was fabricated or untrue. And the way that like other people had been saying that for a while, or they've been like suggesting pretty heavily that like some of that data wasn't reproducible, that they weren't able to get the same phenotypes and markers, and how difficult it was to push the field towards change or towards accepting that. In Victor's lab, we did a lot of work that focused on looking at the role of mitochondria in these rare neurodevelopmental disorders. And for whatever reason, people were really hesitant to use that as a marker of like success, or like accept that that was even possible, that in fact it's not the genetic phenotype, it's the cellular phenotype that's driving these things. So I think on like a scientific level, you always see resistance and you always get backlash. And one of the best ways to deal with that in those cases, I think, is really to like lean into your data and continue to like work the scientific method, as it were, and like trying to disprove your hypothesis, but also being like, okay, think more broadly about what we do. I think in like an interpersonal way, there's not a lot of discussion. There's a lot of like celebratory energy around being the first person to do something or the only person to do something. But people don't really talk about like what that costs you as a human being, because to be the only and to be the first is like very isolating. And it's simultaneously isolating, but it also feels like you can't complain about it because you're the first and the only. So like you should be kind of on your best behavior, accepting like these awards and these accolades. And I think that is, you see a similar thing in comparison to like the science thing that I was just talking about. You see a similar thing in the person aspect of things as well, where it's like, how are we, it's like 2024 and we still have like the first Black graduate of like a program somewhere. And I think it's, instead of like embracing these ideas that like we need to change or like acknowledge those hardships, there's a big effort to like push a lot of those things under the rug, if that makes sense. There's a big movement to just not engage with like the harmful rhetoric or like situations that got us here, and just do the celebrating. And I feel like that's slowly changing, like both in science in general, but I think particularly in the field of neuroscience, just because neuroscience is such an interdisciplinary field. It is like you can really stick the prefix neuro on anything and create a whole new field. And I feel like that makes us a very welcoming place. But sometimes like baggage comes with that too. Whether you're like talking about like what is like neuroengineering and like the stereotypes and predispositions that people have about like engineering degrees and people who do engineering, or like physics even. And so for me, a lot of being different in my experience has been about like walking into rooms and like knowing you're being perceived by people, or that like people are judging you in good and bad ways, right? There are some people that are like genuinely excited that you're there, but there are other people who are like, who's this person? Why are they here? And I think it goes back to my earlier point of like trying to find people who align with you, who you can like walk into those rooms with, who you can also like talk about your experiences in those situations with, to sort of keep you afloat, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Wow, that kind of that was very eye-opening. I feel like I never really saw the scientific community. Not that I'm saying that you've negatively portrayed the scientific community by any means, but I think it definitely kind of shines light to the more nitty-gritty side of things. On that same kind of note, kind of on the side, I'm wondering if, since you transitioned, outside of research, is there a part of you that maybe felt guilty, or maybe you felt like, you neglected this part of research and you felt like, oh, like maybe if I stayed on, like I could have done some real impact? Or are you like, no, I'm doing other impacts in other ways, like screw that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question, because one of the biggest things that I had to grapple with my decision to like lead formal research, like doing bench work, was this innate feeling of failure that I had. That I was like, because I left, I felt like I was a failure, like I was giving up, as opposed to like making an informed decision or just making a new decision, right? I think for me, there was a part of me that had always, like, when I was in college, I had like made a plan that was basically like, okay, I'll go to grad school and then I'll do my postdoc and then I'll become a professor. And then that's it. Like I don't have to, I figured out life and everything else will just like fall into place. And then I started doing those things. I started like achieving those goals, which is wonderful. But they weren't fulfilling the way that I thought that they would be. I wasn't like experiencing the joys and wonders of life as I think life should be lived. I really felt just like burdened, and like I had all of these obligations to do things I didn't even want to do anymore. And I think there's also something to be said to this idea that like when you're a postdoc, the next career phase for you is to become a PI, like to have your own lab and your own research. And there's very little training that happens in your postdoc to prepare you for what that looks like. Like you don't have like manager training. No one teaches you how to like use a science budget really. Like you have to seek out those extra trainings and things. And that's fine. Like I did that. But it's like you're preparing for a job. You're not preparing for the job that you're going to get, if that makes sense. Like you're building a science repertoire when you really need like a leadership repertoire, if that makes sense. And so I loved my postdoc. I did like great work in my postdoc. I was like wildly successful at it. It was fun. But when I kept thinking about like what's going to happen after, like in 3 years when I have to like get a job, and I don't get to even do the parts of this job that I like anymore. Now I just have to go to meetings all day and like do budgets. It sounds horrible to me personally. And so when I was looking for what to do next, I ended up doing career coaching through Anne-Marie's like postdoc office, which if you ever have access to such a thing, I highly suggest. But a big thing that we talked about was this sense of like me really being afraid to leave this thing that I had like only ever known, right? Like I'd only ever studied neuroscience in like a professional way. I'd only ever studied neuroscience. I'd only ever been a scientist. I had never really imagined a different career. And so I think a part of my making that transition to work in nonprofits was accepting that like somebody else is going to get to make those discoveries, and that's okay because those discoveries are going to make them really happy. Whereas like if I were to discover something, I would be pretty lukewarm about it. I wouldn't be as enthused as I needed to be to do the job. And I do think that like scientists, it's one of the best jobs in the world, right? Because you do to do something that you love, but in order to give it its due diligence, you have to love it. You have to actually want it. And if you don't, you're just kind of setting yourself up for disappointment in a lot of ways. And I was sort of tired of doing that. And I wanted just to try something new because I think in truth, we talk about like career path things as like very linear, like you can't go backwards, but there actually is no rule that says that like I couldn't stay in the nonprofit sector for another 2 years and then decide to go be a scientist somewhere. Like Western blots are always going to be a thing that the world needs, unfortunately, for all of us kind of, but that's always going to be a skill that I have. And I think that there's something to like giving more freedom in that sense of like your career path can be loopy instead of like just a straight line.
I feel like this podcast is like for me personally now because I definitely needed to hear that. I feel like especially like a lot of U of T students or students in general, I feel like are so afraid to kind of lean out and kind of be like, hey, I know I've been doing science, especially with science. I feel like, as you mentioned earlier, like there's this idea of, oh, chances are they probably always knew that that was the thing that they wanted to do, right? Like right from elementary school, I want to become a doctor, I want to go into research. And then, you go into high school, you take all these classes, you think you know what you're doing, you go into uni, and maybe you realize, ooh, because now you're actually like getting into it and you actually do labs. And then you're there in the lab for like 3-4 hours wearing these really ugly goggles. And you're like, is this like really like a vibe? Do I really want to wear ugly goggles for the rest of my life? Like, so definitely something I think we all needed a reminder of.
Yeah. And I think that, I don't know, it's a big part of life too. Like once you get new information, you can change your mind. That's okay. That's like a part of the process. But I think you're correct. I don't think that we like encourage people to do that enough. We're just kind of like, nope, you made that one decision, you stick with it until you're 80.
Yeah, back when you were like 12 years old.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. So, talking about neuroscience, so what is your perspective on the current landscape of neuroscience, especially considering all the new fields that are coming up? As you mentioned, like you can stick neuro in front of any field, and it's pretty much a new field linked with neuroscience. So, what do you think about that, and how do you think these trends are going in terms of research and practice?
Yeah, I think this is also a really great question, especially as we think about like AI and like neuroethics, and as we sort of like, for better or worse, create a new field without first setting up regulations around it. It reminds me a little bit of when I was at Georgetown. Georgetown is a Jesuit university, and so they don't allow stem cell research, stem cell based research. You can like do it collaboratively, but you can't do it on Georgetown's premises. So a lot of the people who are doing like very early like pluripotent stem cells or like fibroblast work or iPSCs, they like contract out to like the NIH. And a big part of that is because of like the ethics around stem cell research, like on a societal level, I guess. And I think in terms of like artificial intelligence and AI and this new, like, I feel like I know like 2 or 3 people who recently have degrees in AI, like specifically. It's just kind of like a booming field. It's a booming field with like no regulation necessarily.
Yeah.
And that's kind of scary. Like that is, I think, in a science sense, that's kind of terrifying, especially as AI gets smarter and it advances, and everything that we do right on the internet like contributes to that. I would say the internet is already a pretty unregulated place. There's a lot of things happening in corners of the internet I'm not on. And I feel like the decisions that are being made now will really shape the decisions or lack thereof that are happening now with AI will really shape, I think, the future of all science, if I'm being honest, right? Because so much of what AI is being designed to do is replace things as opposed to add on to, as opposed to collaborate with and work with. It is actually just being designed to make things obsolete. And that's kind of scary. But I do think that there is, I can't remember, and that's probably bad, the dude who's like the father of AI research. He's made like several articles like urging us to do a bit better about thinking about like the ethical implications of what's going on, but also just realistically thinking about like the global impact. And so for me, I think the landscape of neuroscience research it's always going to be big and vast and like exciting and like making you think about things in a brand new way, right? Like I find AI research really interesting as a person who's interested in like what makes a person, like what makes us all unique. And as a lover of sci-fi movies in general. But also as a lover of sci-fi movies, I'm like, we've all seen these sci-fi movies, so we should maybe just like, I don't know, talk a little bit more about what that looks like.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Am I a bit terrified? Yes. Don't let my parents hear this. I feel like there's already enough WhatsApp group chats, WhatsApp posts about AI is taking over the world, like put down your phone, like enough. So let's just table this conversation. But it's clear that you're, well versed in research as well as the current landscape of things, all of which expected from someone who has a PhD, of course. But you've also dedicated yourself to like various advocacy platforms at the same time, right? You're promoting education and inclusion. How do you connect your scientific background to these initiatives, especially, transitioning from PI to playing a significant role in Black and Neuro, as well as being a mentor from time to time?
Yeah, I think works really well for me. Sorry, I might have to sneeze.
Okay, that's fine.
Don't worry about it. Sorry. I think I navigate this pretty well, and a part of that is because I am a developmental neuroscientist. So I'm always interested in how the brain comes together, and for the brain to form, cells go through this process of dealing with intrinsic regulators, so things like DNA and transcription factors, but also extrinsic regulators that shape the cell's identity ultimately. And those extrinsic things are like the environment or like chemokines and chemoattractants, like physical contact mediated things. And I think that the same is really true for the development of people and the development of like scientists in this case specifically, where you have these sort of intrinsic regulators, right? Like who you are as a person. My identity as a Black Samoan queer woman plays a role in my life, in the science that I do. But you also have these extrinsic regulators that also play a role. This idea of like my decision to go to an all-women's college, my choice to go to DCE for grad school, those things combine to make me who I am. And there's a part of that decision-making process that is very similar to what cells go through, in the same way that like the brain relies on diversity of resources, equitable distribution of those resources, and inclusion of various cell types to form and structure. And so to me, those things are innate to the process. I think the hardest part is like shedding light on them and getting other people to like see those similarities and that comparison. But I think science is inherently political. It's inherently about advocacy and promoting education and inclusion, because there's so much that we don't know. And what gives us great science is different perspectives. And there have been like, not just like anecdotally, right? There are like actual research studies that have shown that like diverse labs made up with like many different intersectionalities of identities create the like more innovative research, I think, is the like key term. But for me, those things they just go hand in hand. And it's again about like what makes us who we are and how do we let that play out in the science that we do and the approaches that we have. Like there are ways that I think about neuroscience and neurodevelopment, like the metaphor that I just gave, that I have friends who are not capable of thinking about life in those kinds of metaphors, but they think about things in a different way than me even. And so I think it's just intrinsic to the process and what we are aiming for and striving for in a big way. And I think in terms of Black and Neuro, that has always been like a similar goal, to like build a community that appreciates those differences and nuances.
Now, I did hear that you created Black and Neuro with a group of, well-known online friends. How exactly was that like? Because personally, I feel like a lot of my parents and everyone tells you growing up, like, stranger danger, like, do not engage. So I'm kind of curious to know, like, how did this all play out?
Yeah, I should say we were all like adults, so I do think stranger danger applies to like children, like people under the age of 18. But I think this was in like, or not early, like mid 2020, at like really probably one of the heights of the like ongoing pandemic. But it was after the like social justice uprising that came from the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Aubrey, and after an incident in Central Park with Amy Cooper and a Black man that she had like called the police on. And that movement really started this idea of like recognizing Black people in different spaces. And so that started like Black Birders Week, Black in the Astro Week, and a bunch of other Black and X weeks, basically highlighting that like Black people do all kinds of things. We have like hobbies and experiences. And so I was just a girl on the internet up until that point, as I'd always been. I think I had always had, people are, I think, under a slight misconception. I've always been on Twitter. Like I was on Twitter in high school because I'm old, but also I was just like goofing around. I wasn't using it professionally. I was just like telling jokes and some of them not even that funny. But as I progressed through graduate school, I would find more scientists on Twitter. And so my feed became a little bit more about just like the everyday toils and troubles of doing science, not anything profound. And then after, in 2020, Angeline Dukes, who's our like founding president, and also one of our co-founders, she like put out a tweet that was like, when are we going to do a Black and Neuro week? And I think a bunch of people also wanted to do a Black and Neuro week, but nobody wanted to take on like the full responsibility of planning a whole week of engagement and activities. And so I think ultimately it was like 24 of us came together to do the first inaugural Black and Neuro week. But it really did all start with the tweet. It was like she tweeted that out on like a Wednesday, and then by Friday we had a Zoom to talk about it, and then by the following week we were like working on planning the week and like setting everything up, and then by the end of the month we had our first Black and Neuro week. And so it was just some strangers on the internet.
Okay, so the main message: join Twitter. That's what all our listeners should do.
So as co-founder and president of Black and Neuro, is there any moment or accomplishment that you've done that you're especially proud of?
That's a great question. I feel like I'm really proud of all of it. I think probably the thing that I'm most proud of is the organizing team and the way that like the probably like 20 or 30 people that host our like events, whether that's like seminar series, whether that's like chapter meetups, whether that's like our like policy and finance people, the way that those people have succeeded and excel in their everyday life and have also found community is like very powerful for me. There was a big part of making Black and Neuro that was like challenging to me. I remember one day, I think it was Black and Neuro roll call day, which was like our first day. where I was actually really angry because I had been doing neuroscience research at that point for almost a decade. And I had always been like the only Black person in any program in any space. Like I had gone to all of the big conferences and it was like incredibly isolating for me actually. And like really difficult to deal with in ways that I like didn't have the language for. I like could not explain why I felt so uncomfortable in a lot of these spaces, especially because I grew up in like predominantly white environments. So I wasn't a stranger to like being the only Black person in a room, but like this, it was like getting worse the more I was in grad school. And so by the time we had done Black and Neuro Week, I realized that I was just kind of sad that I had missed out on like all of these Black people who had been doing neuroscience like right under my nose, that like we all existed and like did not know anything about each other and like couldn't find each other. And so like preventing people from having those feelings that I had has been like the biggest joy for me in terms of like connecting people and also like watching them succeed. They're like, I think Angeline said there are like 1 or 2 people that she's met who have been following Black and Neuro since they were like a sophomore in high school. And now they're in college studying neuroscience and they want to like go to grad school. And I think that that's like wild.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. So wow, that probably took, a lot of dedication and a lot of hard work on your part and on your team's part as well, right? And so it's pretty obvious you're very accomplished. You're a campaign manager, you're a co-founder and president of Black and Neuro. And I'm sure that, balancing work and personal life along with the challenges that you mentioned can be challenging. How do you maybe kind of navigate that? How do you manage?
Yeah. So I think there are like abstract ways that I do this and then like practical, pragmatic ways. I think the practical, pragmatic ways are that I'm still very much like a Google Calendar person, for better or for worse. And so for me, and I work really well in like routines and the discipline of routines. And so for me, like using Google Calendar to like physically schedule in like time for breakfast, time for lunch, time for like yoga, time for whatever, like putting those things in my calendar and like taking those events as seriously as like a meeting in that dedicated space is really important for me. In that same vein, like as you get older, your friends will unfortunately not always be in the same place as you. And so I also prioritize a lot visiting my friends and talking to my friends and checking in on them. And like we have like weekly like chats, like, I don't know, we'll just send voice notes back and forth on WhatsApp, like we're on our own little podcast, like prioritizing those relationships has always been really big for me. And then because I moved back, one of the reasons I moved back to Georgia is because my dad is here and he's retired now, which comes with its own set of challenges because he's just bored all the time now. But I love him, so it's fine. But a big part of also how I get through the day is by making sure that he and I like go to breakfast, that we see each other all the time, that we like talk. And so those are like some of the practical ways that I like balance all of the things that I do. I think in like a bigger abstract sense, when I made that transition from like doing science to working in nonprofits like I do now, I had to be like really honest about what I actually enjoyed and wanted out of life, like not what I was doing for my family or doing like because I thought I was supposed to do it or like should do it. And that was really difficult because you don't realize how much of your life you like can accidentally live for other people, if that makes sense. My family is like particularly Southern, so the idea that I am like 32 and unmarried without children just every once in a while like makes their brains like kind of explode a little bit. They like get really annoyed about it. But it's been like, I don't know, it's been like a learning experience for all of us because I'm like, in a very like Marie Kondo kind of way, only do things that bring me joy. Like I'm trying to live a life that I find rewarding and happy. And for now, like I'm doing all of the things that bring me that kind of joy. And I think a part of doing that though is kind of having really honest conversations with yourself about what you like and what you don't like, what kind of future you see for yourself. And sometimes realizing too that like you don't need like a 10-year plan, actually. Like you can just like decide to like see what happens for the next like 3 months without a plan, without like a big overarching plan. And so for me, a lot of those challenges, like I can tell when I'm getting stressed because I will like lean too much into work. But I can also tell when I'm like really enjoying myself because I lean so much into the other parts of my life that are exciting. And it's, I don't know, it's like I find the easiest way for me to like create balance is to remember the things that I like to do as a child. And as a child, I liked to like read and be outside and
Yeah.
like help my family cook. And so those are like where my hobbies stem from now.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm definitely a Google Calendar girly myself, and I definitely planned the next 10 years of
See?
my life. And, I feel like I can definitely relate to you, especially, coming from a South Asian background, and I'm sure plenty of students out there at UTSC can relate. Like, you really do sometimes feel like you're living for others instead of yourself. And I think, prioritizing that time and prioritizing those days to actually dedicate time to do stuff you enjoy, you truly enjoy, is definitely advice I could have used 3 months ago. So we're a bit late, but that's fine.
And I think too, there was always I was always really worried that I would like disappoint my dad. He's a pretty like surly guy. He's like a stereotypical dad. And I think in his retirement, he's learned, through his retirement, we've both learned to like talk to each other better about like his expectations of me, which he basically is like, Kaela, I have no expectations of you. I just want you to be happy. And I feel like if I had had that conversation with him earlier in life, my life probably would look a little bit different, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like parents usually pull a fast one on you later on. And it's
Absolutely.
like, dude, where were you? Like, this is something we should have done before.
Yeah.
But hey, it's better to get it at least at one point.
So looking back at your undergraduate days, are there any lessons or moments that have stuck with you? And how have these lessons or moments shaped the way you work today?
Yeah. What a good question. I feel like broadly, yes. One of the things that I really loved about my research when I was an undergrad was that I was very naive. I like didn't know what I was doing. Like I was very naive. I like didn't know how to pipette, obviously, until somebody taught me. And I feel like leaning into that energy of just like asking a lot of questions and like really trying to sense the vibe of people. I always say that I don't know if I would do neuroscience research if I didn't have like the PIs and the mentors that I had then, because like they saw something in me that like I could not see in myself. I was just a girl like trying to get paid to like do research. I was like, somebody gave me the scholarship, so I'm gonna obviously work in this lab for money. But I don't know what I'm doing. But all of my mentors were always incredibly adamant that I was like naturally gifted at this thing and that I should do it. And so I feel like surrounding yourself with good people has always been like the biggest lesson for me, but also like sort of trusting your instincts, whether or not something feels like it's working or not, was big. And even though I didn't have a lot of confidence in what I was doing, I could like tell the people around me genuinely wanted me to succeed, if that makes sense. And there was something to like the collaborative nature of the work that we were doing that felt really great. And I feel like that's always stuck with me because every step of my science career, even to my transition leaving, was through a collaborative effort, was through like building community and talking to people and like trying to figure out what was best for me and having people sort of like reflect back to me like their thoughts and their feelings about like my ideas. I am a person who I would say I'm pretty decisive, but the way that I am decisive is that I will ask my best friend what they think. And then once they say it out loud, I'll be able to tell if I care about what they think or not pretty quickly. I'm not saying that's the best way, but it is a way to go about making decisions.
Okay.
And it helps.
Speaking of undergrad days, we do have one last and final question before we end things off, and this one is especially for our listeners. I know we briefly sort of touched on this, but many STEM students worry about the career prospects outside of research, medical school, or grad school. I know myself included, I've been told several times, your only options are research, medical school, or grad school. And, having transitioned into the nonprofit sector, what are your thoughts? And do you maybe have any advice for those considering a similar pathway, or even for those trying to break through and get into research?
Yeah, I think my like first thought is that there are a bajillion things you can do with a science degree. There are like so many. And I definitely encourage people to like go to the career offices at their like respective universities at whatever like stage of life they're in, because there's a 1000% chance that like your career development center has like access to a resource, access to a job board, access to something that could even just get you a step closer into being where you want to be. And then in terms of like finding careers outside of academia, I think a question I get asked a lot is like, if knowing what I know now, would I like still have gone to graduate school? Like, would I still have gotten my PhD? And the answer is no. I would. But I do think it's important for you to like make time to sit and think about your goals and what they might be, like what career you want to do. At the time, when I was like 22, I wanted to be a professor. And in order to be a professor, you would have to have a doctorate. So it made sense. But there were moments when I was in graduate school that I could sense that I didn't really want to be a professor, that I like wasn't having a fun time. But I just kind of stuck it out because I was afraid of quitting and I was afraid of starting over, which I think are like valid fears and valid concerns for people to have. But I think most importantly, in terms of career things, like the biggest thing for me is to think about like what you actually need to do the thing that you want to do. Now, so much of the work that I do is about like using social media. It's about like staying up to date on pop culture, on science communication. So much of what I do is about like influencing policy and talking to people who are like in charge of universities, in charge of like publishing systems, in charge of departments, to get them sort of like change their philosophies and minds and the structures that they build. And so I think that job is not, the job that I have now is not a job that I thought existed when I was in undergrad. And I don't even know if someone had like been like, Kaela, you should apply to this like campaign manager job, if I would have known what they were even saying to me. So I think part of it too is giving yourself room to like be a different person. Like you are going to grow and change your mind and change your plan, and that is 1000% okay. And actually it should happen. Like I think it's a sign that you're learning more about yourself and you're like leaning into what's next. And I think the biggest advice that I have for people who are looking to like go into graduate school or go into research or not is really just to have like faith and confidence in yourself. Like I am really of the millennial mindset that you can do anything that you put your heart and mind to. Like you really can. You just have to make sure you surround yourself with people who support you and believe in you. And I think that's the thing that actually takes the most time, is for you to like get in the right environment so that you blossom and grow. But once you figure out what that environment is, what you feel, once you like experience that for the first time, it will be so easy for it to guide you in everything else that you do.
Definitely great advice. I know I'll be heading to the career center soon so I can refine my 10-year Google Calendar. Thank you so much, Dr. Singleton, for just taking the time to participate, come chat with us today. I really do believe your journey and story is something that a lot of students will find beneficial. I know I really did. And to our amazing listeners, stay tuned for our next podcast to learn more about all things neuro. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep listening.
That's it for today, folks. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of SYNAPSE Talks by SYNAPSE U of T. By the way, the marvelous music that plays at the start and end of the episode is called Arcade by Artur Aravidi. It is licensed under an Attribution Non-Commercial 4.0 International License from Creative Commons. You can access this music at freemusicarchive.org. And if you want to hear more episodes of SYNAPSE Talks, you can visit our website at synapse.sa.utoronto.ca. That's synapse.sa.utoronto.ca. Bye for now.